Welcome. Today we are going to talk about Hegel, who, in the big question of how should we proceed with philosophy after Kant, his voice kind of rises to the top. And in many ways, he's seen as one of the great intellectual leaders of philosophy in that early modern post-Kantian era, and how to resolve some of the questions that Kant may or may not have left out there. Do we accept Kant? Do we reject Kant? Do we modify Kant? Did Kant leave any questions? Hegel thought he did, and this is where his contribution to philosophy is. Some people really gravitate to Hegel and agree with his critique or correction or addition to the Kantian philosophical system. Other people push back against Hegel. Again, he's one of these pivotal figures that philosophy kind of moves on, and you will engage with. You'll either agree with Hegel or you won't. He's oftentimes a little more ambivalent for a lot of people, and in some ways just as confusing as some of the others. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, yes, the German names just seem to be getting longer and longer, was born in 1770, the same year as Beethoven, and will die in 1831. As a young man, he studied the Tübingen Protestant Seminary, one of your major Lutheran seminaries, but his writings at the time were not very devout. Following this, he gained a job as a tutor to a wealthy family in Bern, Switzerland, and later to Frankfurt. In 1799, his father died, and he had a small inheritance, and he decided to use this inheritance to become a philosopher, and ended up studying with Schelling in Jena. Here, he's going to write his first book, and in many ways, this is seen as his greatest work, the Phenomenology of Spirit. He stayed in Jena until Napoleon's armies shut down the university after the famed Battle of Jena in 1806. Hegel's later philosophy was largely shaped by the French Revolution and a slow souring to the ability of people to govern themselves, which is really the outcome a lot of people had about the French Revolution. You kind of entered into it with a lot of hopes about what Enlightenment ideologies can bring, and then you saw the terror, and you saw the mistakes, and you saw the infighting, and you saw all that other stuff, and fairly slowly a lot of people soured it. And Hegel is in many ways just a representative of those ideas as well. After he was done completing the Phenomenology of Spirit, he will travel to Nuremberg, where he's going to write his second major work, The Science of Logic. These are really the only two works whose primary audience were other philosophers. After the publication of Science of Logic, Hegel will move off to Heidelberg, where he's going to be involved in teaching far more, and kind of turns his attention scholarly to kind of how it's going to help his students in many ways. Here he'll end up writing the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. This was used as the sort of primary for his philosophy students, and as his courses grew and changed, so did the different editions of this work. In many ways, it's the textbook, but he's writing that himself. Finally, he's going to move off to his dream job at the university in Berlin, University of Berlin, etc. At the time, this was known as the Humboldt University of Berlin, with people like Fichte and Schleiermacher being the founders of this university, along with Humboldt. Hegel, some people kind of puts in that category. He definitely was not a founder of the university, but he was there early enough, kind of taking that place of Fichte. In fact, getting into the job at the University of Berlin, Humboldt's university, was one that took a lot of kind of wrangling, and a lot of division is going to be sowed between Hegel on one side and Friedrich Schleiermacher on the other. Hegel always believed that Schleiermacher kind of tanked him and didn't let him get the job, and a lot of infighting, although truth be told, Schleiermacher disliked a little bit of Hegel, but he never really tanked him, and some of the animosity that Hegel will have towards Schleiermacher is undeserved. These two often would write against one another but never by name. So it's kind of this weird gentlemanly, like, I hate you, no, I hate you, sort of idea, where their ideas are being challenged by one another. Famously, Hegel once said of Schleiermacher's idea that religion is utter dependence or absolute dependence upon God, that this is the pinnacle of what religion is. Hegel kind of quipped at Schleiermacher, if this is the case, then my dog, who's utterly dependent upon me, would be the most pious individual around. Again, this is a fun sort of quip, but not really a fair reading of Schleiermacher by any stretch from Hegel. Here, Hegel once again writes another work to try to help his philosophy students along. This is the philosophy of right, and this is the work that he's going to do there. And he will then later on, before too long, die in 1831 from cholera and the cholera epidemic that is there. He was more excited to finally be in Berlin than probably any other period in his life. He really liked Fichte and was excited to take the philosophy chair once Fichte vacated it and try to carry on some of Fichte's ideas of Kantianism and how it should be interpreted. Hegel's philosophy was directly tied to challenging the assumptions of the modern world. And in many ways, we should applaud Hegel for this starting point to his philosophy. He looked around at the modern world and he liked what he liked and he didn't like what he didn't like, but his thought was, I'm going to challenge what I see. I'm going to challenge the assumptions of my own culture and see what about them are good and valid. This is a very difficult task. I've heard an anthropologist and sociologist once talk about analyzing your own culture as trying to bite your own teeth. That there's just this difficulty that is there because so many of your own assumptions you take completely for granted and you don't even know really how to approach it. So we should applaud Hegel for at least the venture. For Hegel, though, this started in large measure with disagreeing with Descartes. He really didn't like Descartes' belief that we needed to start all over to find out if indeed something is true. Hegel said we can never do that. We can never start off by dismissing all of our preconceptions. That we need to just go from where we are now and then proceed. So it's very interesting that his critique of his own culture is in such saying we can't start from nothing, that we have to start from where we are, and this is part of his challenge of Descartes. It seems almost a little counterintuitive that this is his interpretation on how we should proceed, but this is it. Hegel believes that we can challenge some of our assumptions and maybe get rid of some things, but we can't strip it all down like Descartes did. That trying to find the one kernel of truth and then building on that is kind of a waste of time and not even a good exercise for philosophy. Whose ideas he really wanted to build on, and the men that he really admired the most was Johann Fichte, 1762, and Friedrich Schelling, 1775 to 1854. Fichte will die in 1814. And these two men were those that liked Kant, but wanted to reinterpret and re-understand Kant. They believed that Kant's philosophy was incomplete and they needed to fix it. And for Hegel, Fichte and Schelling became the types of what Kant really meant. Kant really meant this, or Kant's critique was falling flat otherwise. Hegel then assumed that he was really the inheritor of Fichte and Schelling and their philosophy, and that his philosophy completed Kant's. Hegel believed that Kant was in principle correct, but again, incomplete. That Kant had the right step in talking about this sort of wall between phenomena and noumena, that we can't ever know the Ding nach sich, the thing in itself. But Hegel kind of steps this a little bit farther, saying there is no thing in itself, and that is actually the flaw, that we're always understanding everything as phenomena, that there could never be an intelligible thing that wasn't itself phenomena, that wasn't what it was because it was experienced by us. Again, the idea that experience is completely valid, and indeed that ideas exist are valid. These are the corrections. These are what Kant did brilliantly, according to Hegel. But that there is this actual other thing that exists apart from our experiences. He says this doesn't work. The result of that is that it would bifurcate human experience and end up creating two realities. One that is understood by us and another one that exists apart from us. And he says, philosophically speaking, we can't see this. This is sort of the two-world criticism that Aristotle and others would have over Plato, and Plato's distinctions of the realm of the ideas versus the realm of the material world or reality, however we want to kind of discuss that and understand that for Plato. And so Hegel is very much saying, Kant, you fell into this Platonic trap. You were doing really good, but you messed up here. Kant was aware of the works of Fichte and Schelling and this idea that his works needed to be corrected. And he really didn't like it. His idea is that his work doesn't need correction. I don't need you to come and fix my philosophy. It's good enough on its own. It's better than yours. It's this groundbreaking solution. I've synthesized these two disparate schools. You're kind of growing in my legacy and trying to interpret my works, but I don't need you to do that. But yet Hegel, for all of what he is, believed that no, this is still a mistake, that there is no noumena, there is only phenomena. And that otherwise you're correct, but we need to look at things from this perspective. So the idea here for Hegel is that there becomes this sort of phenomenology, his major work, and that this serves as a corrective for Kant, or again, a completion of Kant. In this work, his Phenomenology, Hegel introduces the concept of the Geist, or spirit. The idea is that knowledge arises out of the lives of people through their collective efforts to know the world and themselves. He borrows upon notions of Socrates and the idea that philosophy was, in effect, a large Socratic dialogue, that this is really what philosophy is. But this dialogue does not have a beginning, as Descartes and Kant would argue. Instead, it is more like a river, and that we just have to jump in. This analogy, by the way, of the river is mine. It's not Hegel's, but it largely fits and applies into this idea, right? That we just have to jump in to where the stream is. Maybe you're going to pick a good spot, but you can only look up or down the shore so far. And this is what we have to do, really, according to Hegel's ideas. His main difference with Kant is, again, that we cannot separate theoretically the condition, so knowledge from knowledge itself, whose real and practical conditions arise only within this knowing process. Reason is not pure, as Kant argued. Rather, it is impure and all a posteriori, or experiential. That this is the source of our reason. That there is no abstract knowledge, like Kant would argue in his critique of pure reason. We can never examine our understanding of a thing outside of our consciousness of it. So he's not going as far as Hume did, of saying that there is no anything, but we always understand things from our interpretations, from our consciousness. That we cannot ever even conceive of this noumena, but only the phenomena. All elements in this whole knowledge process are contained within our consciousness. And again, we're getting closer to Hume than we are to what Kant would do by following Hegel. But again, it's the same sort of idea, but not quite. Right? The tree, for instance, to go back to that fun example, only exists in our mind, sort of. There might be, in fact, a real tree, and Hegel's willing to say that, but we cannot know it. So he's not saying that things don't exist, just our knowledge of it is always through our experience of it. So this is, again, that division of what we would say Hegel is on one side and Hume on the other, right? It's not just about our rational conceptions of our experience, but our understanding of things, which may be real, is always going to be done in our mind and our mind's interpretations of our mind's events, right? I know, a little confusing, but maybe not. All knowledge is then itself circular. And circular reasoning works because that's all of what reasoning is. It always starts and ends in our mind. Right? In fact, in some ways, Hume didn't even go far enough then for Hegel. I'm thinking about something, and then I see it. And then I reflect upon what I thought of what I saw. So we probably are familiar with the phrase that I wouldn't have believed it if I didn't see it. But there's also the idea that I wouldn't have seen it unless I believed it. And now I believe it because I've seen it, which is, very circular. But this is, according to Hegel, the way that our minds work. Knowledge by itself is inadequate. That we have a dialectical confrontation between ideas that shape ourselves and our reality. So, what is reality? Reality exists as this sort of dialectical process. It is this unfolding of Geist, of spirit, and mirrors what happens in our own mind and our own understanding. Reality is doing its own thing the same way that we do our thing. Right? We have this sort of image of something, right? If A, then B, if B, then A, where we just jump in because this is the only way to approach it. We either have to say it is, and therefore we're able to move forward, or we're missing out entirely. Reality is this unfolding of this Geist, this world spirit, which might adjust and change from time to time, but is always this act of unfolding, and is always this way because of understanding, because it always exists in itself. Really, this is best probably understood through what is generally referred to as the Hegelian dialectic. And Hegel never actually drew this up, but it's his ideas, right? That we have a thesis, we have an idea in itself, not a thing in itself, but an idea in itself. And then we have an antithesis, a contrary or opposing idea. Maybe it's directly opposed, maybe it just criticizes some of it, or maybe it's an alternate perspective on how to look at it. The Geist is this unfolding process where the thesis will confront the antithesis, and what will result is the best parts of both, a synthesis. This synthesis then becomes a new thesis, a new idea, a new thing, idea in itself. And this new synthesis will confront a new antithesis, and once again produce yet again a newer synthesis, which will confront another antithesis, taking the best parts of both and resulting in once again, even newer synthesis. And this cycle goes on and on and on, which is Part of the reason why, for Hegel, we can't start by criticizing everything. We can't go back to Descartes' you didn't go far enough, right? Or you go back and you find that one kernel, because that one kernel isn't a thing on its own. It's throwing a cup of water into the river and then running downstream and trying to collect that cup again. It's dispersed into the rest of the stream. It's gone, even though it's there. The parts of it still exist, and it did add, and it's a part of it, but it's been changed so much that it doesn't exist as a kernel of an idea itself. All ideas are this confrontation of one idea or another. This conflict is the resulting of what we understand now, and that's why we have to kind of jump in right now and take an idea, right? This is the way that reality unfolds. Geist, this unfolding spirit, is this dialectic process taken as a whole. This dialectic takes place in our minds as well as the unfolding of world's events. Right? The events that surround us are a part of this as well. Particular entities or events are real only as aspects of the life of this Geist, of this spirit. The mind is a part of all of this as well. Individuals' minds are the absolute mind, objectifying itself and becoming self-conscious in human self-consciousness. And so we are participating in this Geist, this absolute mind as well, but reflecting upon that in our own self-consciousness. In some ways, this sounds a little transcendental in many different ways. The mind exists subjectively as knowing and reasoning. It exists objectively as nature and history. And it exists absolutely as the idea. We end up getting this quote from Hegel that what is rational is real and what is real is rational. In modern terms, the mind exists, but the self is something that is socially constructed, where our desires and our self get confused and conformed into what we would call ourselves. Again, if we're going to apply notions of psychology and sort of modern ideas into this idea. But since the individual gains understanding of themselves through any and all social mediation, the state, for Hegel, is supreme over the individual. The state is the collective where the Geist unfolds, and our understanding of all of this is to take place in and for freedom, for that Geist is to shape us, makes us, us. So it's all, again, socially mediated relations, but the society as a whole is, in large measure, what is correct through the largest expression of this unfolding Geist. Hegel was rather optimistic about this exchange, even though others would point out some of these flaws. One of his largest critics during his life was Arthur Schopenhauer, 1788 to 1860. Schopenhauer believed that most people, most of the time, were deluded, right? And Hegel too, right, from Schopenhauer's perspective. And that there is little of this that changes since humanity began. Schopenhauer is not very optimistic about this unfolding Geist sort of ideas. In fact, Hegel and Schopenhauer knew each other. They taught at the University of Berlin at the same time. Hegel was far more popular than Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer really didn't like Hegel to the point that he made sure all of his lectures were done at the same time as Hegel, so you have to pick. You're either going to follow Hegel or you're going to follow me. Hegel was a bigger draw, unfortunately, for Schopenhauer, and what ended up happening was that most of his classes for Schopenhauer were empty. But hey, or not empty, but you know what I'm saying. You're not as big of a draw. This isn't working. And it would have probably been better if he placed his classes at different times so people could have heard his critiques. Because many of us today might be attracted to some of Schopenhauer's ideas over Hegel's. But again, Hegel ended up becoming the bigger name and the bigger draw. Nature, by the way, exists in the same way. Hegel's system is built on this triad of nature, idea, and spirit. The idea in itself, the thesis, is that which develops. It is the dynamic reality of the world. In fact, it is that which exists before the world. The idea outside of itself, the antithesis, is space or nature. And therefore we have, again, nature and the ideas, and they confront against each other. And nature will eventually develop into man. This unfolding also takes place in history. The development of consciousness is, in fact, history's unfolding in itself. History, in turn, is the autobiography of God, or the reality of God. And through this history, the history of life of man and man's institutions, spirit achieves its goal of self-consciousness and freedom. In and through man and his growing self-consciousness and freedom, spirit achieves its own realization as freedom, the idea which understands itself. Hegel makes the unfolding of history not a matter of physics, biology, or theology, but philosophy. And philosophy is then the unfolding of everything. You want to understand the world. The only place for Hegel's perspective to do it is as a philosopher. So you're on your way by being here for Hegel. Hegel's idea of the dialectic, right? The thesis, the antithesis, the synthesis, the idea outside of itself, and this new development that takes place is not only the unfolding of history, but throughout the 19th century becomes the unfolding of many different sorts of understanding about how the world works. And it is applied in many other fields outside of philosophy. But in large measure, they all have this outgrowth from borrowing from Hegel and this idea. He's that influential. We see this idea very firmly with natural selection as understood by Darwin, right? You have the species, you have the challenges of that species that limit reproduction, and you'll have the survival of the fittest, who then gets to repopulate and shape that species. This is very much following on this notion of the world Geist, but just from a biological perspective, looking at movement of one species to another. We have the same thing even when we're looking at notions of psychology and the inner workings of your mind, right? The id, ego, and superego, as advanced by Freud, follows very much within this sort of Hegelian dialectic frame. We also have this applied into the field of economics by Karl Marx, who was educated and studied amongst Hegelians. In fact, would fall into a radical group of people known as young Hegelians that we'll address later on when we talk about Marx. In fact, the unfolding of history, according to Marx, is following very specifically that same sort of Hegelian model. If ever you've used that phrase, the right side of history, this follows Marxism, which is the idea that history will unfold in one sort of way just because that's the way things are. We now have the world Geist without the God behind it for Marx, but he's following Hegel's ideas on this, just beyond what Hegel would have likely appreciated. Is Hegel was a big fan of Adam Smith and his economic and moral theory based upon this economics as well. So we see this sort of unfolding of this dialectic in many other fields, and Hegel's import, while we may or may not agree with his philosophy, at least this dialectic is something that grows and is wildly influential into all sorts of different realms of thought and academic practice throughout the 19th and 20th century. Outside of history unfolding itself as this world Geist, this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, the Hegelian dialectic, Hegel is probably most known for his discussion about individual psychology through what's known as the master and slave. In 178, he states that self-consciousness exists in itself and for itself, in that and by the fact that it exists for another self-consciousness. That is to say, it is only by being acknowledged or recognized. So again, this opening might sound fairly confusing. The idea is that your understanding of yourself only exists for your understanding as an object for which you are to recognize. That you look upon yourself as the object, and therefore you are that object that is being looked upon, although that gets far more confusing. Hegel puts it another way. He says there is unity in its duplication, that our understanding of ourself becomes one, but only because there's two. Again, this is a little odd of an idea, but is rather important for Hegelian thought. Continuing on this in 186, he states, self-consciousness is primarily simple existence for itself, self-identity by exclusion of every other from itself. It takes its essential nature and absolute object to be ego, and in this immediacy, in this bare fact of its self-existence, it is individual. That which for it is other stands as unessential object, as object, with the impress and character of negation. Again, somewhat confusing to understand, but we have this idea, right, that yourself is you excluding everything else, and that is what makes it yourself. You exclude everything around you to make you you, and your self-consciousness, by its basic identity that it is your identity, has to exclude itself from everything else around it, and yet its existence is tied in with all of this world around it. This only gets possibly more confused or clarified, depending on how you'd like to look at it, when Hegel says that the other is also a self-consciousness. An individual makes its appearance in antithesis to the individual. And again, we see very much his idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis moving through with that as well. But that which looks at the self is also an individual which confronts the self, but is the self. When you look at yourself, there is the object to which you are looking at, but there is also that which looks at the self. So again, there's this duplication of yourself to try to figure out who you are. The object cannot be the subject, for otherwise it is the subject and not the object. Just basic grammar rules, right? But when addressing the object, it is the subject to the object. Right? You can, from the other perspective, you are the subject to that object. They both exist for one another, yet they are independent individual forms or modes of consciousness that have not risen above a bare level of life, right? That there's the object and the subject that exist in your mind when constructing who you are. And this becomes the creation of the self. Each is indeed certain of its own self. Both the subject and object, when you're looking upon yourself, view itself as itself, but not the other, as Hegel says here. And hence, its own certainty of itself is still without the truth because it's bifurcated. It doesn't understand that it is indeed both, but only one. The process of bringing all of this out involves a twofold action. Action on the part of the other and action on the part of itself. Insofar as it is the other's action, each aims at the destruction and death of the other. You're either the subject or the object. You are either the master or the slave, the dominant or the submissive, to follow Hegel's idea. And again, he's not talking about relations between individuals. He's talking about relations within yourself. that there are these two thesis and antithesis constantly at work. And eventually outside is what we're going to see within this synthesis, right? They must, these two impulses, enter into this struggle, for they must bring their certainty of themselves, the certainty of being for themselves, to the level of objective truth, and makes this a fact both in the case of the other and in their own case as well. This is not an optional struggle or fight. Each side must assert itself or die, or at least become weak and the subservient, the slave of this end. It is solely by risking life, and he uses life and death as this discussion, that freedom is obtained. Only thus it is tried and proved that the essential nature of self-consciousness is not bare existence. Existence is not simply consciousness. You can exist without being aware of anything. This requires reflection, and reflection results in change. Change is a trial and a death to the old self. New change, death has come in. That old self is gone and dead and doesn't exist. But in 188 he says, this trial by death, however, cancels both the truth which was to result from it, and therewith the certainty of self altogether. Because everyone's always, looking at each other to cause this death of the other, there is a change and a loss in this confrontation as well. Continuing on in 189. In this experience, self-consciousness becomes aware that life is as essential to it as pure self-consciousness. Both moments are essential, since, in the first instance, they are unlike and opposed, and their reflection into unity has not yet come to light. They stand as two opposed forms or modes of consciousness. The one is independent and is essential nature to be for itself. The other is dependent, and its essence is life or existence for the other. The former is master or lord, the later is the bondsman. In this confrontation, one ends up dying, ends up getting made subservient, doesn't affirm itself as its identity. Since there are two, the only one who asserts itself and rises up can become the master. The one that now views itself as the other, as the object of itself, is the subject. Right now, if you were to stop and think about yourself, you have two images in your mind. You have that which is doing the thinking, that is the master. And you have the subject, which is the slave. Right? This is the way that he's seeing it. 190, he says, the master is the consciousness that exists for itself, but no longer merely the general notion of existence for self. Rather, it is a consciousness existing on its own account, which is mediated with itself through another consciousness. It can't exist apart from these other words. In other words, through another whose very nature implies that it is bound up with an independent being or with thinghood in general. Since he is the power dominating existence, while this existence again is the power controlling the other, controlling the bondsman, the slave. The master holds par excellence consciousness, this other in subordination. The master can only be the master in relation to the bondsman or the slave. It uses this object to assert itself, and otherwise it wouldn't be the master and you couldn't do it. It is not at all independent, but rather a dependent consciousness that's going to be taking place. In all of this, the unessential consciousness is, for the master, the object which embodies the truth of his certainty of himself. The only way you're certain of yourself is because there is this second consciousness. Again, It is not an independent, but rather dependent consciousness that he has achieved. He is thus not assured of self-existence as his truth. He finds that his truth is rather the unessential consciousness and the fortuitous unessential action of that consciousness. Again, to look at this a little bit more, the master is not truly free. He is still dependent. He is dependent upon the slave as much as the slave is dependent upon the master. There's just one who is subordinate to the other. It is also not the same as consciousness as the beginning, as it is now, is a consciousness that exists in relation to the other. Right? Again, we have this dialectic at play. One is always confronting the other, and what's emerging is the greater of the two. 195, he states that the consciousness that toils and serves accordingly attains by the means the direct apprehension of that independent being as itself. Again, we're using this notion of apprehension, as we've talked about with Bonaventure and others, right? But we're now applying this into our own notion of self, and not just the sensible world around ourselves. In 196, he says, in the master, the bondsman feels self-existence to be something external, an objective fact. In fear, self-existence is present within himself. In fashioning the thing, self-existence comes to be felt explicitly as his own proper being, and he attains the consciousness that he himself exists in his own right and on its own account, and für sich, as opposed to the thing in itself, for its own account. Thus, precisely in labor, where there seem to be merely some outsider's minds of ideas involved, the bondsman becomes aware through this rediscovery of himself, by himself, of having and being a mind of its own. So by being the bondsman, the mind knows that it is its own self, that it exists. And now we have both of these ideas kind of moving through and creating. And in many ways, this is very difficult to understand, but it's the idea of creating your own identity and your own self. As we see here that the bondsman exists and has to exist, that it is from the relationship with the master that the bondsman has an identity as well. And so even though it's subservient, it has an existence as well. It gets yeah, but I'm still here. I still have an identity, and I know who I am in relation to the master consciousness as well. They're both exist one to another. And this is a really odd idea, but probably one that is understood maybe a little bit easier when we relate it to St. Augustine and his writings of the self. Remember, again, he had this idea of, is there two selves, right? Is there this good self and this bad self? The ideas that existed within Manichaeism, and he was challenging this idea of saying, no, this isn't the case, and yet Hegel almost seems to be coming back and saying, there are two selves, but one isn't good and bad, one is master and one is slave, one is the object of self-reflection, and one is that which does the reflecting. So who is that? How do we do this, right? For Augustine, the goal is mystical union of the self, right? The nous, or the spiritual intellect, with God, or the one. There's this mind or spiritual intellect that moves things through, this active intellect, as opposed to a passive intellect that is the soul, right? And so we have here this active and passive intellect that Augustine talked about, that did not include a bifurcation and saying, no, one doesn't exist, but one is the active idea, this spiritual intellect, as opposed to just that which takes in the senses, the passive intellect. And so we can maybe apply this in that way as well, even though Hegel would have said so if he really wanted to identify it this way, and he didn't. But if we looked at his other arguments in the philosophy of mind, which due to other just basic limitations we don't have time to get into, right? We see that the knowledge of the mind is the highest and the hardest just because it is the most concrete of these sciences. He says that we can't easily do this. And that his aim of the philosophy of mind is only to reintroduce this unity of idea and principle into the theory of mind and try to fit into a more Aristotelian angle of this. So there is nature and the truth as this absolute identity, and yet this absolute identity is also absolute negativity, for whereas in nature the intellect unity has some sort of objectively perfect but externalized ideas. And so there is this unfolding of this Geist not only in our mind, but how our mind relates to the broader world. And the unfolding Geist becomes a part of that. Right? That this is the way that we should look at mind. And this is difficult because he's really talking not about anthropology or even the way that mind works, which you would talk about different ways of approaching mind. But this is a psychological idea, and this then becomes also what he would say is the birth of the soul, is this awakening of consciousness. That consciousness sets itself up as a reason, awaking, but at the time bond to this notion of rationality. And this reason is by the activity. It will emancipate itself into this objectivity and the consciousness of this intelligent unity. And this is really kind of the end goal of all of that, which is closer to Augustine, although still rather complicated in getting there. But this is the other sort of aspect of Hegel that Hegelian scholars kind of look at first and say, all right, I've got it, and my understanding of Hegel, and then kind of come back at it later and go, oh, wait, let me look at this again. Do I like this idea? Do I not like this idea? What do I like about it that is fulfilling? What do I find problematic about it? And kind of moving over and over and over again. And the changes that exist within ourself through just different notions of self-reflection. And what survives out of those notions of self-reflection. And this is, the unfolding of you as an individual. We talked about Hegel. We talked about his great impact in his reinterpretation of Kant, what Hegel saw as completing Kant and what Kant saw as completely unnecessary, as he was already complete. We talked about the easiest and greatest contribution of Hegel and how most of us would see this in that idea of his dialectic, of the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. We saw how there's always this sort of dialectic, this unfolding of ourselves within ourselves. As we have both thesis and antithesis, we have master and slave, to use the language of Hegel within this, or bondsman and master. And yet we also see how this unfolds in reality, that there's kind of a bifurcation of our identity, but that's what makes our identity individual, is that it is this multiplication by division, this addition of our identity through looking at it in different aspects, in different ways. It helps unfold some of the psychological issues we have. And we talked about Hegel and his great impact of the dialectic and how it applies in all sorts of fields throughout the 19th and 20th century. You guys could probably stop and reflect here in various different avenues and see if you think his argument works. Is it valid? Or is it off too much? Do we need to accept the idea we have to just jump into the idea that there is no noumena, just phenomena, and it's all in the mind, and the fact that it's circular is, of course, obvious because it has to be circular? Or is Kant right? Is there a thing in itself, and while we might not get to know it and approach it, it does exist, and that this doesn't really create any more multiplication than what Hegel does when he's talking about how our mind works. That there is a subject and an object, and that doesn't only exist in our mind. Hopefully that all works. Makes sense. Again, Hegel is one of those guys that's easy to understand quickly and hard to understand when you spend more time with them, right? And that's kind of the way a lot of these guys are.